Living in Traverse City, Michigan, had always been a dream for Laura. She'd grown up in a small town about 2 hours south and often talked about how the shimmering waters of Grand Traverse Bay felt like home to her. When we moved there 3 years ago, it was supposed to be the start of something beautiful, our way of planting roots in a place that felt permanent. For the most part, it was. I worked as a contractor, taking on a mix of small-town renovation jobs and larger projects for clients across the state. Laura worked at a local marketing firm, specializing in social media strategies for small businesses. We weren't rich, but we made do, saving what we could and spending weekends hiking trails, trying new breweries, or just sitting by the bay. But this past year, Laura seemed restless. It started small. She began talking about needing a hobby, something just for herself. At first, I didn't think much of it. Life gets monotonous sometimes, especially when you've been married for 8 years. She dabbled in a few things, knitting, watercolor painting, even gardening. Nothing stuck until she stumbled upon photography. "I've always wanted to learn how to take real pictures," she said one night, scrolling through online reviews of cameras. "Not just phone pictures. Real, professional ones." "Sounds expensive," I joked, sipping my beer. She shot me a look that was half smile, half challenge. "What's life if you don't invest in yourself?" That was Laura in a nutshell. When she latched onto something, she went all in. Within a week, she'd ordered a mid-range DSLR camera and signed up for a local photography class. At first, I loved seeing her excitement. She'd come home from class buzzing with energy, showing me pictures of trees, old barns, or random strangers she'd convinced to pose. She started following photography forums and watched endless YouTube tutorials about lighting and composition. One Saturday, she dragged me to Sleeping Bear Dunes to be her model. I hated having my picture taken, but she was so enthusiastic I couldn't say no. "Okay, tilt your head a little to the left," she said, crouching in the sand to get the angle she wanted. "Perfect. Just like that. Do I get paid for this?" I asked, squinting against the sunlight. She laughed. "You get paid in compliments. You look great." I didn't, but I didn't care. Seeing her happy made it worth it. A month or two after she started the class, she mentioned meeting someone who shared her passion for photography. "His name's Darren," she said over dinner one night. "He's super talented. He's been doing photography for years and knows all the ins and outs. He's been helping me with some of my editing stuff." "That's cool," I said, barely glancing up from my plate. At the time, it seemed harmless. Laura's social circle had always been small, mostly coworkers or casual acquaintances from town. Having someone to share her new interests with felt like a good thing. "He's got this crazy collection of vintage cameras," she went on. "And he knows all these secret spots around Michigan that are amazing for photos. We're going to check out a few after class this weekend." "Just you and Darren?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She nodded. "Yeah, why?" "No reason," I said, shrugging. "Just wondering." "Don't worry," she said, smirking. "I'll bring back plenty of pictures to prove I wasn't off having some wild adventure." It wasn't the first time Laura had teased me about my jealous streak. To be fair, I had been a bit overprotective early in our relationship, but 8 years of marriage had dulled that edge. I trusted her. Over the next few weeks, Darren's name started coming up more often. He was always suggesting new locations for shoots, abandoned buildings, hidden lakes, or scenic overlooks. I started noticing that her Saturdays were booked more often than not, and even when she was home, she spent hours editing photos or chatting in photography forums. "Why don't you come with me sometime?" she offered one evening when I asked about her plans for the upcoming weekend. "To meet Darren?" I joked. "To spend time with me," she corrected, rolling her eyes. "But yeah, you could meet Darren too. He's a good guy. You'd like him." I mumbled something noncommittal and changed the subject. It wasn't that I didn't want to meet him, I just didn't see the point. Laura had a hobby, and that was great. Why get in the way of it? Then, one evening, I found myself sitting alone in the living room while Laura worked on her laptop in the kitchen. She'd been glued to her screen for hours, editing a batch of photos from her latest outing with Darren. "Hey," I called, trying to sound casual. "What's Darren like?" She glanced up, her expression neutral. "He's nice. Funny, smart. Kind of a photography nerd, but in a good way." "Why?" "Just curious," I said. She tilted her head, studying me. "You don't think it's weird, do you? Me hanging out with him?" "No," I said quickly. Too quickly. "Because it's not," she added firmly. "We're friends." "That's it." "I know," I said, raising my hands in mock surrender. "I'm just asking." "Relax." She stared at me for a moment longer, then shrugged and went back to her laptop. But something about the way she avoided my eyes left me unsettled. The next few months passed in a blur of normalcy, but Darren's name lingered like background noise. Laura spent more and more of her weekends out on photography trips, often texting me pictures of waterfalls, dilapidated barns, or moody landscapes. I tried to tell myself it was just her passion pulling her in deeper. In the evenings, she would show me her work, flipping through photos with a mixture of pride and self-criticism. "See the light here?" she said one night, pointing to a shot of an old wooden bridge. "It's not quite right. Darren said I should have used a reflector." "Looks fine to me," I said. She sighed, clearly unimpressed by my lack of technical knowledge. "Well, you're not a photographer." It was a harmless comment, but something about the way she said it made me bristle. One Saturday, I decided to surprise her by showing up at the spot she'd mentioned for her shoot that day, a nature preserve about 30 minutes outside of town. I packed us a thermos of coffee and figured I'd spend a few hours watching her do her thing. When I arrived, the lot was nearly empty, except for Laura's car and an older Jeep. I wandered along the main trail, keeping an eye out for her bright yellow camera bag. Eventually, I spotted them in a clearing by the riverbank. Laura was crouched low to the ground, angling her camera toward the water, while Darren stood nearby, holding a piece of white fabric to bounce the light. They looked like they were in their own little world, laughing at some inside joke as Laura adjusted her camera. I stayed back, unsure why I felt like an intruder. It wasn't like they were doing anything inappropriate. Still, something about the ease between them made my stomach tighten. "Hey!" I called, stepping into the clearing. Laura turned, startled. "Jake! What are you doing here?" "Thought I'd bring you some coffee," I said, holding up the thermos. She smiled, but it felt a little strained. "That's sweet. We're almost done here." Darren stepped forward, wiping his hands on his jeans. He was taller than I'd imagined, with a scruffy beard and an air of casual confidence. "You must be Jake," he said, extending a hand. "Yeah," I said, shaking it. His grip was firm but not aggressive. "Nice to finally meet you." "Same here," he said. "Laura talks about you all the time. You've got a good eye for DIY, huh? She showed me pictures of your house. Impressive work." I nodded, unsure how to respond. Something about him rubbed me the wrong way, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The drive home with Laura was quiet. She thanked me for the coffee but didn't say much else, scrolling through her photos on her camera. I wanted to ask if she thought Darren was too friendly, but I stopped myself. It would only make me sound insecure. Still, the feeling lingered. Over the next few weeks, little things started adding up. Laura had always been open with her phone, leaving it on the counter or handing it to me to look up a recipe. But now, she seemed more guarded. One night, as we sat on the couch, her phone buzzed with a text. She glanced at it, then tilted the screen away from me. "Who's that?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Just Aaron," she said. "He sent me a link to a new editing software. It's nothing." "Cool," I said, but my mind was racing. It was nothing, I told myself. Darren was her friend, her mentor. She told me a dozen times there was nothing between them. But late at night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the image of them laughing by the riverbank. A few days later, I decided to poke around online. I wasn't proud of it, but curiosity got the better of me. Darren had a public Instagram account filled with stunning photos of Michigan landscapes, each one captioned with poetic reflections. Scrolling through his feed, I came across a picture he'd posted a week ago, an old stone chapel surrounded by trees. The caption read, "Hidden gems are best shared with kindred spirits." I recognized the shot immediately. It was from the day I'd surprised Laura at the riverbank. The comments below the photo were filled with generic praise: heart emojis, fire emojis, the usual stuff. But one comment stood out. "You captured it perfectly!" It was from Laura. I told myself I was overreacting. Darren was just a friend. Laura was just passionate about her hobby. But no matter how many times I repeated it, the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. One night, as Laura worked on her laptop, I walked up behind her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "What are you working on?" I asked. She jumped slightly, minimizing the screen. "Just editing," she said quickly. "Can I see?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then reopened the program. It was a picture of a forest, dappled in sunlight. "It's beautiful," I said, though my eyes weren't on the photo. They were on her expression, tight, guarded, almost defensive. "Thanks," she said, forcing a smile. I didn't press further, but my mind was already spinning. The following week brought little relief. Laura was more distant than ever, spending most evenings immersed in her laptop or editing photos on her phone. Her enthusiasm for photography hadn't waned, but our conversations felt hollow, as though she was only half listening whenever we talked. One night, I decided to approach the subject head-on. We were sitting at the dinner table, eating in near silence except for the occasional clink of silverware. "You've been busy lately," I said casually. She looked up, her fork hovering midair. "Yeah, I guess so. It's just a lot to learn, you know. Darren's been showing me new techniques, and I've been experimenting with editing styles. It takes time." "I get that," I said, leaning back in my chair. "But don't you think it's a little much? You've barely had a free weekend in months." She frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I said quickly. "I just miss spending time together, that's all." Her expression softened, and for a moment I thought I'd gotten through to her. "I miss that too," she said quietly. But then she added, "It's just that this is important to me, Jake. It's the first time in a long time I've felt this, excited about something. Can't you just be happy for me?" Her words stung, but I forced a smile. "Of course I am. I just don't want us to lose what we have, you know." She nodded but didn't say anything more. The conversation hung in the air, unresolved. A few days later, Laura mentioned another weekend trip with Darren. "We're heading up to Pictured Rocks this time," she said as she packed her camera bag. "It's supposed to be amazing for photos this time of year." I tried to mask my frustration. "You're spending a lot of time with him lately." She froze for a moment, then resumed packing. "He's my photography partner, Jake. That's all. You're reading too much into this." "Am I?" I asked, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. She sighed, zipping up her bag. "Look, I can't help it if you're feeling insecure. I've told you before, there's nothing going on. If you don't trust me, that's on you." Her words cut deep, but I didn't argue. The truth was, I did trust her, or at least I wanted to. But the nagging doubts refused to go away. The weekend dragged by. Laura sent a few pictures of the cliffs and waterfalls, each one captioned with enthusiastic comments about the scenery. I replied with short, polite responses, trying not to dwell on the fact that Darren was the one standing beside her, sharing those moments. When she returned on Sunday evening, she seemed happy but tired. I asked how the trip went, and she launched into a detailed description of the locations they'd visited and the shots she'd taken. But as she talked, I noticed something subtle. She never once mentioned Darren. Over the next few weeks, the distance between us grew. Laura spent more time out of the house, often claiming she needed to clear her head or find inspiration. I tried to give her space, hoping things would eventually go back to normal, but the tension between us only seemed to deepen. Then, one night, I found myself alone in the living room again, staring at Laura's laptop on the coffee table. She was upstairs taking a shower, and her camera bag sat by the door, half unpacked. I don't know what came over me, but I opened the laptop and entered her password. It was still the same as it had always been. Her editing software was open, along with a folder labeled Pictured Rocks. I clicked on it, expecting to see more of her stunning landscape photos. Instead, I found a single folder tucked away at the bottom, labeled with just a date. My stomach tightened as I opened it. The pictures inside weren't landscapes. They were of Laura. The photos weren't what I'd expected. They were portraits of Laura, candid and intimate in a way that felt different. She was sitting on a rock in one, her hair blowing slightly in the wind, her gaze soft and contemplative. Another showed her laughing, caught mid-motion as though she hadn't realized the picture was being taken. I scrolled through, my pulse quickening with every click. These weren't just photos of a woman. They were photos of someone admired, someone cherished. And I hadn't taken them. My chest tightened as I stared at the screen, the implications swirling in my mind. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe Darren had simply captured her in the moment as part of their trip. Maybe she didn't even know these were in her folder. But deep down, I knew better. When Laura came downstairs, I closed the laptop and forced myself to look normal. "Hey," she said, rubbing a towel over her damp hair. "You okay? You look tense." "Yeah," I said, managing a weak smile. "Just tired, I guess." She studied me for a moment but didn't press. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photos. I heard Darren's name in my head, saw the way she smiled when she talked about him. By morning, I was a wreck, torn between confronting her and staying silent. I decided to test the waters. "You've been working a lot on those Pictured Rocks photos," I said casually over breakfast. She nodded. "Yeah, there were some really great shots. I think a few might be portfolio-worthy. Did Darren take any of you?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She hesitated, just for a moment. "A couple, yeah. He's got a good eye for portraits. Can I see them?" Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Why?" I shrugged. "Just curious." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "They're not that great. I don't even think I'll keep them." Her response only deepened the pit in my stomach. Over the next week, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was being kept from me. Laura continued her outings with Darren, her explanations growing vaguer each time. One evening, I decided to follow her. It felt ridiculous, like something out of a bad movie. But I couldn't ignore the gnawing suspicion any longer. She told me she was heading to a nearby park for a sunset shoot, so I waited 10 minutes after she left and drove over. Her car was in the lot, parked next to Darren's Jeep. I stayed back, watching from a distance as they set up their gear by the shoreline. They were talking, their voices too low to hear, but their body language was what caught my attention. Laura was smiling at something Darren had said, her head tilted slightly as she laughed. Darren reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch lingering just a second too long. I clenched the steering wheel, torn between storming over and driving away. In the end, I did neither. I just sat there, watching them through the windshield as the sun dipped below the horizon. When Laura came home that night, she seemed cheerful, even chatty. "How was the shoot?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Beautiful," she said, smiling. "The light was perfect. I think I got some amazing shots." I nodded, not trusting myself to say more. As she went upstairs, I stayed in the kitchen, staring at the empty space where she'd stood. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like I didn't know her at all. The days that followed were an uneasy balancing act. Laura carried on as though nothing had changed, but for me, everything had. I couldn't stop replaying what I'd seen at the park, Darren's hand brushing her hair, the way she'd laughed. I told myself it could still be innocent, that maybe I was reading too much into it. But a voice in the back of my head wouldn't let me rest. One Friday evening, Laura told me she was heading to a gallery opening in Grand Rapids with Darren and a few others from her photography class. You could come if you want, she said, though her tone lacked enthusiasm. Maybe next time, I said, trying to sound disinterested. She nodded and kissed my cheek before heading out. I waited for her car to disappear down the street, then grabbed my keys. I didn't have a plan, just a gnawing need to know the truth. The gallery was a small, upscale space tucked into a row of downtown shops. When I arrived, it was already crowded with people sipping wine and admiring prints hung on white walls. I scanned the room until I spotted Laura and Darren near the back. They were standing close, their heads tilted toward each other as they spoke. Darren said something, and Laura laughed, touching his arm lightly. I felt a surge of anger and started toward them, but halfway there, I stopped. What was I doing? I couldn't confront her here, in front of a room full of strangers. Instead, I lingered near the entrance, watching from a distance as they moved through the gallery. To anyone else, they probably looked like two friends enjoying an evening out. But to me, every glance, every touch, felt like confirmation of what I'd been dreading. When Laura came home that night, she was in high spirits, chatting about the exhibit as though nothing was amiss. I nodded along, pretending to listen, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't live like this anymore. The next morning, I decided to confront her. Laura, can we talk? I asked as she was pouring her coffee. Sure, she said, though the guarded look in her eyes told me she knew what was coming. I took a deep breath. Are you and Darren more than friends? Her face went pale. What? You heard me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I need to know what's going on. Jake, this is ridiculous, she said, shaking her head. Darren and I are just friends. I've told you that 100 times. Then why do you hide things from me? I asked. Why do you get so defensive every time I ask about him? I'm not imagining this, Laura. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then she set her coffee cup down and folded her arms across her chest. You're right, she said softly. You're not imagining it. My heart sank. It's not what you think, she continued quickly. It didn't start like that. We were just friends, I swear. But somewhere along the way, I got confused. Confused? I repeated, my voice rising. What does that even mean, Laura? Tears welled up in her eyes, but I couldn't tell if they were from guilt or frustration. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said. It's just, I've felt so distant from you lately. And Darren was there, and he listened, and I don't know. Her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. For so long, I'd clung to the hope that this was all in my head, that I was being paranoid. But now, hearing her admit it, I didn't know what to do. Her confession hung in the air like a storm cloud, crackling with tension. I stared at her, my chest tight, my mind racing to make sense of her words. The kitchen, usually the warm heart of our home, suddenly felt cold and alien. What exactly are you saying? I finally asked, my voice low and steady, though inside I was anything but calm. Laura wiped her face, her hands trembling. I'm saying I've been selfish, she said quietly. I let things go too far. I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. Define too far. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the window as though looking for an escape. We've kissed, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt the air rush out of my lungs, leaving me gasping for breath. Kissed? I repeated, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. That's it. She nodded quickly, almost too quickly. I swear, Jake. That's all it's been. I would never. Her voice trailed off, and she looked down at her hands. Never what? I pressed, my voice sharper now. Never sleep with him? Never betray me like that? Laura, do you even hear yourself right now? Her eyes snapped up to meet mine, glistening with tears. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said, her voice breaking. I didn't want to hurt you. Didn't mean to? Didn't want to? I shot back, my anger bubbling over. You think that makes it better? You've been sneaking around, lying to my face, and now you want me to believe this was some kind of accident. She flinched, her tears spilling over. Jake, please. No, I interrupted, slamming my hand on the counter. You don't get to please me right now. You don't get to cry like you're the victim here. You made a choice, Laura. You chose him over me. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Laura stood there, her shoulders slumped, her face streaked with tears. You're right, she said finally, her voice barely audible. I did make a choice. But I didn't choose him over you. Could have fooled me, I muttered bitterly. She took a shaky breath. I chose to let myself feel seen, heard. I don't even know when it happened, but somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like I mattered to you, Jake. Like we mattered. Her words sliced through my anger, leaving me stunned. What are you talking about? I asked. I've always supported you. I've always been there. Physically, yes, she said, her tone soft but firm. But emotionally? Jake, you've been so checked out. I've felt invisible for years. I stared at her, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a stone. That's not fair, I said weakly. Isn't it? She challenged. When was the last time we had a real conversation? When was the last time you asked me how I was feeling, or what I wanted? You don't even look at me the way you used to. Her words stung because, deep down, I knew there was some truth to them. I sank into one of the kitchen chairs, burying my face in my hands. So what now? I asked, my voice muffled. I don't know, she admitted. I never wanted it to come to this. I wanted to tell you, but I was scared. And then things just kept spiraling, and I didn't know how to stop. Stop what, exactly? I asked, looking up at her. She hesitated again, her silence louder than any words. Laura, I said, my voice dangerously calm. Is there more you're not telling me? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The hesitation, the guilt in her eyes, it was all the confirmation I needed. I stood up, my heart pounding. Tell me the truth, I demanded. All of it. Right now. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Jake, please. Don't make me. Tell me. I shouted, my voice echoing off the walls. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. Yes, she said finally, her voice barely audible. We slept together. The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I felt sick, like the ground had been ripped out from under me. How long? I asked, my voice hollow. Only once, she said quickly. It was a mistake, Jake. A horrible, stupid mistake. I hated myself the second it happened. Her words blurred together as I tried to process what she was saying. I wanted to scream, to rage, to break something. But all I could do was stand there, numb and silent. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice choked with sobs. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know how much I regret it. I love you, Jake. I never stopped loving you. I looked at her, searching for some sign that this was all a bad dream. But the tears in her eyes, the raw pain etched into her face, it was all too real. I need time, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I need to think. She nodded, wiping her face. I'll give you space. Whatever you need. Without another word, I walked out the door, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen. I drove aimlessly that night, the streets of Traverse City blurring into one long stretch of shadows and streetlights. The quiet hum of the car did little to drown out the storm in my mind. I replayed every word Laura had said, every moment we'd shared over the past few months, and every time I'd ignored that gnawing feeling in my gut. How had it come to this? Eventually, I found myself parked along the bay, the water rippling faintly under the pale moonlight. This had always been our spot, a place we came to unwind, to talk, to dream about the future. Now, it felt like a mockery, a cruel reminder of what we'd lost. I sat there for hours, staring at the horizon, my thoughts swinging between anger and heartbreak. I wanted to blame her, to hate her for what she'd done. But beneath the fury, a quieter voice whispered truths I didn't want to hear. She was right. I had checked out. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped paying attention, not intentionally, but in the way people do when life becomes a series of routines. Work, dinner, TV, bed. I'd assumed she was fine because she never said otherwise. But should that excuse her? By the time I returned home, the house was dark and silent. Laura was asleep, or pretending to be. I didn't bother checking. Instead, I grabbed a blanket and crashed on the couch, my body exhausted but my mind refusing to rest. The next morning, Laura approached me cautiously, like someone trying not to spook a wild animal. "Did you sleep okay?" she asked, her voice tentative. I shrugged. "Not really." She nodded, twisting her hands together. "I meant what I said last night," she said softly. "I'll give you as much space as you need. Just please don't shut me out completely." I didn't respond, couldn't bring myself to meet her eyes. The days that followed were a painful blur. Laura stayed out of my way for the most part, leaving me to brood in silence. I buried myself in work, taking on extra projects just to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, the memories always crept back in. The way she'd smiled when she talked about Darren, the photos I'd found, the crack in her voice when she admitted the truth. At night, I lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling and wondering where we went wrong. A week later, Laura broke the silence. "We need to talk," she said, standing in the doorway of the living room. I looked up from my laptop, my stomach tightening. "About what?" "About us," she said, stepping inside. "I can't keep tiptoeing around this, Jake. We need to figure out where we go from here." Her words felt like a slap. "Where we go?" I repeated, setting my laptop aside. "You're the one who cheated, Laura. You don't get to decide what happens next." She flinched but didn't back down. "You're right. I don't. But I also can't keep living in limbo, waiting for you to decide if you still want me." I stared at her, my chest tightening with a mix of anger and sadness. "Do you even want this marriage anymore?" I asked. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "But not like this. Not if we're just going to keep hurting each other." Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. That night, I found myself standing in our bedroom for the first time in days. Laura was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face drawn and pale. "I don't know how to fix this," I admitted, my voice breaking. She looked up at me, her eyes shimmering with tears. "Maybe we can't," she said softly. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking into my chest like a stone. "What are you saying?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I think we need to let each other go," she said, her voice trembling. "Not because I don't love you, but because I've hurt you too much. And maybe we've both forgotten how to love each other the way we used to." We didn't say much after that. The decision wasn't sudden. It was like watching a fire slowly burn itself out, leaving nothing but ashes. 2 weeks later, Laura packed her things and left. There was no screaming, no dramatic goodbyes. Just a quiet hug at the door and a whispered, "I'm sorry." I watched her drive away, my heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. The first few days after Laura left felt like stepping into a void. The house, once filled with her laughter, her scent, her energy, now echoed with a deafening silence. I walked from room to room, aimless, my mind replaying the moment she closed the door behind her. I hated how much I missed her. Her mug was still on the counter, the one she used for her morning coffee. A sweater she'd forgotten hung on the back of the dining chair, a stray hair caught in the fabric. Everywhere I turned, I saw traces of her, and each one cut a little deeper. At work, I threw myself into projects, staying late just to avoid coming home. My coworkers noticed my mood but wisely stayed out of it. I wasn't ready to talk, and frankly, I wasn't sure I'd ever be. Nights were the worst. The couch had become my new bed, but sleep was hard to come by. I'd lie there for hours, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts swinging between anger and regret. I kept asking myself the same questions over and over. Had I done enough to fight for her? Should I have begged her to stay? Or was letting her go the right thing to do? A month passed. Laura didn't reach out, and neither did I. Part of me wondered if she'd moved on already, if Darren was now the one standing beside her with a camera, sharing in her world. The thought made my stomach churn, but I pushed it down. One evening, I found myself scrolling through her Instagram. It wasn't something I did often, but loneliness and curiosity got the better of me. Her account was still filled with beautiful photos, landscapes, sunsets, old buildings, but now there was an emptiness in them I hadn't noticed before. She'd captioned one of her latest posts. "Even the most beautiful places can feel lonely sometimes." I stared at the words for a long time, my chest tightening. Was she talking about herself? About us? The following weekend, I decided to clear out some of her things. Not because I wanted to erase her, but because the constant reminders were suffocating me. As I emptied her closet, I came across a box tucked away in the corner. Inside were photos, prints from her earliest photography days. There was one of me, sitting on the dunes at Sleeping Bear, a goofy smile on my face as she snapped the picture. Written on the back in her handwriting were the words, "My favorite subject." I sat down on the floor, the box in my lap, and cried for the first time since she left. Weeks turned into months. The pain didn't fade, but it dulled, settling into a quiet ache that became a part of me. I stayed busy, fixing up the house, visiting old friends, trying to piece my life back together. But no matter what I did, she was always there, lingering in the back of my mind. One evening, I ran into an old friend of Laura's at the grocery store. She hesitated when she saw me, as if unsure whether to say hello. "How's Laura?" I asked, forcing a casual tone. She gave me a small smile. "She's doing okay. She's figuring things out." I nodded, not trusting myself to say more. That night, as I sat in the living room, I thought about everything that had happened. For so long, I'd been consumed by anger, by the betrayal, by the pain of losing her. But beneath it all, there was a part of me that still loved her, that still wanted her back. Could I forgive her? Could I forgive myself? The next morning, I picked up my phone and stared at her number. My thumb hovered over the screen, my heart pounding. I didn't call. Instead, I walked out to the bay, the place that had always been ours. I stood there for a long time, watching the waves lap against the shore, the wind carrying the faint scent of pine. I didn't know what the future held. Maybe we were meant to find our way back to each other. Or maybe we were meant to stay apart. All I knew was that I wasn't ready to let go of the hope that one day, we might start again.